2:17. The sea looks calm, but the war is already happening inside the ship. On the screens, the sky is full of dots, some real, some fake, some too small to be trusted, and some moving so slowly they blend into clutter. The crew is not fighting missiles. They are fighting time, bandwidth, and uncertainty all at once. A modern warship can still have plenty of weapons left and still be losing, because the first thing to fail is not the launcher, it is the picture. When the picture fractures, doctrine becomes a superstition. You keep doing the old steps because the checklist is familiar, not because it still works. This finale is about that moment, the point where the old logic breaks and a fleet either evolves or it starts sinking by spreadsheet math. This is Battletech Declassified. Modern Warfare Explained. Here is the uncomfortable thesis. Big ships are not bad, but big ships built around a single nervous system are becoming a liability in a world of cheap mass. We know the trend lines. Sensors are improving, drones are multiplying, electronic warfare is getting cheaper, and targeting data is spreading across the battlefield faster than ever. What we do not know is the exact shape of the next naval fight, the geography, the rules of engagement, the mix of decoys versus real threats. But we can see the direction. The attacker's advantage is not genius, it is volume, and volume punishes anything that depends on one perfect chain. So the shift is not optional. Fleets must distribute, automate, multiply sensors, multiply cheap interceptors, and remove single points of failure, or the math will choose the winner before the first explosion is even seen. The old doctrine treated a capital ship like a castle, tall walls, a moat, a few expensive knights, and the belief that quality beats quantity. That logic made sense when the threats were limited, when the enemy had to pay a high price for every shot, and when the defender could see most of what mattered. But swarms and saturation flipped the table. Now a castle is not a fortress, it is a beacon. The bigger the ship, the more it needs a perfect sensor picture, a perfect data flow, perfect coordination between radars, electronic warfare, fire control, and human decision. If any one part lags or lies, the castle's strength becomes its trap, because everything depends on one brain making sense of everything, in real time, under deception. A single point of failure is not just a broken radar. It is any choke point where the fight must pass through one narrow door. A single combat system that must classify hundreds of tracks, one communications pathway that can be jammed or spoofed, one command team that can only make so many choices per minute. You can upgrade the missiles and still lose if the ship is forced into the wrong prioritization game. The attacker does not need to destroy your weapons. They only need to overload your ability to decide and to make you spend your best shots on the wrong things. This is why doctrine shifts. The goal is not to build one unbeatable ship. It is to make the fleet hard to confuse, hard to saturate, and hard to cripple with one lucky hit or one successful deception campaign. Distributed fleets sound like a buzzword until you picture it like this. You do not defend a city by putting every police officer in one building. You spread them, you give them radios, you give them local autonomy, and you design the system so losing one station does not end the entire response. At sea, distribution means more hulls, more nodes, more sensors at more angles, and more shooters that can contribute without waiting for one central brain to bless every action. It also means the enemy has to solve a harder puzzle, not blind the flagship, but manage a moving web of sensors and weapons that can reroute around damage. The ocean is big, and dispersion turns that size into your advantage, instead of a hunting ground for the attacker. We already see pieces of this in real fleets, helicopters extending the horizon, drones scouting ahead, cooperative engagement concepts, and networks designed to share tracks. But the doctrine shift goes further. It treats every platform, crewed or uncrewed, as a contributor to the kill chain, not a spectator. It also treats distribution as a counter to saturation, because a swarm loves centralized targets. If the enemy can focus their deception, their jamming, their decoys, and their mass on one ship, they can play one set of weaknesses. If the fleet is distributed, the swarm must split, and splitting is the enemy of mass. Distribution is not about being everywhere. It is about never being all in one place, physically or digitally, so the attacker cannot win with one perfect punch. Autonomy is the most misunderstood word in modern warfare. People imagine robots making moral choices. In practice, autonomy is about speed and workload. It is the difference between a driver braking instantly versus calling a committee meeting first. When threats arrive in waves, the bottleneck becomes the human decision cycle. Humans are brilliant, but we are serial processors in a parallel fight. We can only truly focus on a few things at once. And under stress, we simplify, we anchor, we follow habits. A saturation attack is built to exploit that. It creates more important things than any team can humanly handle. So autonomy is not replacing commanders, it is protecting commanders by letting machines do the time-critical sorting, filtering, and low-level engagements so humans can make the strategic calls. The key is layered autonomy with guardrails. You do not want a system that fires blindly. You want a system that maintains the picture, cross-checks sensor confidence, flags anomalies, and can execute pre-approved responses when the clock is too fast for humans. Think of it like an airbag. It triggers instantly under defined conditions, while the driver still controls the trip. What we know is that modern combat systems already automate parts of tracking and engagement. What we do not know is how autonomy will behave under heavy deception when the sensor world is poisoned. That is why autonomy must be paired with distribution and redundancy, multiple sensors confirming, multiple nodes comparing, and the ability to degrade gracefully instead of failing suddenly. The doctrine shift is building a fleet that stays functional when the fight becomes too fast for human hands alone. More sensors sounds like more eyes, but the real point is more angles. One radar, no matter how advanced, has physics limits, horizons, clutter, and blind spots. Low, slow drones can hide in sea clutter. Small cross-sections can fade into noise. An electronic attack can create ghosts. If your fleet depends on one exquisite sensor, you are betting the war on one set of assumptions. More sensors means different modalities: radar, passive RF, infrared, electro-optical, acoustic, off-board drones, and even small picket craft acting as forward ears. Each sensor is imperfect, but a mesh of imperfect sensors can be more truthful than one perfect-looking screen. Sensors are also ammunition, because a track is what enables every weapon to matter. You can have the best interceptors in the world, but if you cannot maintain a reliable track through jamming and decoys, you are shooting blindfolded. The doctrine shift is treating sensing as a distributed service, not a single ship function. That is why off-board and airborne sensors matter so much. They change geometry. They look down instead of sideways. They see around curvature. They force the attacker to jam in more directions. And when the fleet shares those sensor perspectives, it becomes harder to poison the whole picture. The attacker can still create confusion, but they must work harder for every lie, because the lie must survive cross-checking across multiple independent nodes. Expensive interceptors are like using gold bars to stop rocks thrown at your window. It works, but it is an economic defeat disguised as a tactical victory. Saturation attacks thrive on cost exchange. The attacker spends little per threat, the defender spends a lot per response, and the defender runs out of shots first. This is why more cheap interceptors is not a minor detail. It is the center of the new math. If the attacker can force you to waste premium missiles on low-value drones and decoys, they are not trying to destroy you, they are trying to bankrupt your magazine. Then the real weapon arrives when you are empty, or when you hesitate because you cannot afford another mistake. Cheap interceptors do not mean sloppy defense. They mean matching the tool to the threat. You need a mix: soft kill like jamming and deception, medium-cost interceptors for mass targets, and high-end missiles reserved for the truly dangerous threats. This is the same logic as firefighting. You do not use the same hose pressure for every flame. You triage. The doctrine shift is building depth in the magazine, more layers that can engage, more opportunities to stop a threat without paying a luxury tax each time. We know navies are exploring and fielding different point defense options, and we know directed energy and smart guns are long-term hopes. But even without sci-fi, the principle is clear. You win saturation by multiplying the number of affordable no decisions you can make per minute across the fleet, not by making one perfect yes missile. The enemy's smartest weapon may not be the explosive, it may be the decoy. In a saturated battle space, a decoy is not just a fake target, it is a time thief. It steals classification cycles. It steals radar attention. It steals interceptor inventory. And most dangerously, it steals confidence. When operators see tracks that behave strangely, or when jamming blurs the edges of the picture, hesitation grows. Hesitation is lethal because modern defense timelines are short, and a few seconds of doubt can be the difference between a clean intercept and a late intercept that spills fragments into the ship. This is why doctrine cannot be built on the assumption of a clean world. It must assume the screen will lie, sometimes convincingly. So the shift is to design for deception, not just for firepower. Distributed sensing helps, autonomy helps, and so does doctrine that expects ambiguity. Instead of waiting for perfect certainty, fleets need procedures for good enough confidence based on cross-confirmation, behavior patterns, and threat corridors. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty, it is to keep uncertainty from freezing the kill chain. What we know from modern electronic warfare is that jamming and decoys are built to create either false positives or false negatives, to make you shoot at nothing or ignore something real. The fleet's answer is redundancy plus resilience, multiple ways to detect, multiple ways to engage, and a command structure that can keep moving even when parts of the picture are degraded. The ship that survives the next era is the one that can fight while partially blind, not the one that needs perfect vision. For decades, command and control at sea felt like a cathedral, one altar, one choir, one conductor, and a belief in central harmony. The future looks more like a street fight, noisy, fragmented, fast, and full of partial information. In a street fight, you do not wait for the perfect plan. You rely on intent, training, and decentralized action aligned to a shared purpose. That is the doctrine shift in one sentence. Distributed fleets need distributed command, not chaos, but mission-type orders, predefined engagement policies, and local initiative. Otherwise, you build a distributed fleet and then strangle it with centralized approvals that arrive too late. This is also how you remove single points of failure at the human level. If the flagship's command team is overloaded, the rest of the fleet must still function. If one data link is jammed, local nodes must still defend themselves and contribute when possible. The future fleet is a network that can degrade gracefully, losing bandwidth, losing nodes, taking hits, and still retaining enough sensing and shooting to survive the wave. This is why doctrine shift is not just technology, it is philosophy. You stop worshipping the perfect platform and start engineering the imperfect web. In the next segments, we will make it concrete. What distributed fleets actually look like in practice, how autonomy changes the OODA loop, how magazines become layered, and how you build a fleet that cannot be one-shot in the way older doctrine still quietly assumes. Picture a fleet as a living organism, not a single animal. In the old model, the fleet fought like a whale, huge, powerful, and dependent on one spine. In a distributed model, it fights like a school of fish. Many bodies, many angles, hard to corner, and impossible to kill with one clean strike. The practical version is not fantasy. It is a set of roles that can be mixed and matched. A few large ships as command and long-range sensors, several medium combatants as shooters and escorts, and a growing layer of smaller crewed and uncrewed nodes acting as pickets. Some nodes carry radar, some carry passive sensors, some carry jammers, some carry extra missiles, some carry decoys, and some exist purely to complicate the enemy's targeting. The point is that the fleet's brain is not located in one hull. It is distributed across many contributors, and the kill chain becomes a mesh. Detect here, classify there, track there, engage over there, without forcing everything through one control room. This changes the attacker's problem. Instead of saturating one ship, they must find, identify, and overwhelm many nodes, and that is harder than it sounds because the ocean is full of emptiness. Distribution leverages geometry. A drone swarm works best when it can approach from predictable corridors, force the defender to look in one direction, and pile confusion into a single sensor picture. A distributed fleet can place sensors forward, offset, and elevated, which means the attacker's approach is seen from more than one perspective. If one node is jammed, the fleet still has other perspectives. If one node is hit, the fleet still has other shooters. If one data link is disrupted, local defense still occurs. We know this kind of resilience is what modern networks try to achieve, but at sea it requires doctrine to match the hardware. A fleet cannot be distributed in metal and centralized in mentality. If the fleet still waits for one central permission before acting, it will behave like an old fleet when the clock is fastest. The shift is to treat distribution as a warfighting principle, not a procurement slogan, and to design every mission plan with the assumption that parts of the network will be degraded. Not because the enemy is magical, but because the enemy's cheapest strategy is to attack your coordination. Autonomy becomes real when you define what decisions must be made faster than humans can reliably make them. Think about what saturation really is. It is not just many objects, it is many objects arriving inside the same short window. In those windows, human teams face an impossible workload, classify dozens of uncertain tracks, assess jamming, confirm identities, allocate interceptors, coordinate with other ships, and avoid shooting down friendly aircraft or wasting ammunition. Humans can do some of that, but not all of it simultaneously, not repeatedly, not without error. So, autonomy is the tool that converts chaos into manageable categories. The system must be able to maintain track quality, rank threats by behavior and proximity, propose allocations, and execute pre-approved engagements when the risk is within defined bounds. This is not about removing humans. It is about removing the need for humans to micromanage physics. The commander should decide intent and policy, not which button to press in the last 3 seconds. The fear people have is understandable. What if autonomy makes a wrong call? That is why doctrine must define autonomy as a spectrum, not a switch. At one end, the system suggests, and humans approve. In the middle, the system acts automatically in limited zones, for example, when a track crosses a defended corridor and meets multiple confidence checks. At the far end, the system can defend itself locally when communications are lost, because waiting for approval is the same as accepting impact. The practical guardrails are rules of engagement translated into machine-actionable policies, plus continuous sanity checks, like comparing sensor sources and looking for deception signatures. We know false tracks and decoys can be convincing, and we do not know how perfect future deception will be, but we can design for graceful failure. If confidence drops, the system should shift to safer behaviors, prioritize self-defense, request human input, or increase passive sensing. Autonomy should not be a single brain that either works or fails. It should be many small helpers that reduce cognitive load, accelerate response, and keep the fleet from freezing when the screen becomes ambiguous. This is the doctrine shift. Accept that humans will remain the moral and strategic authority, but stop pretending humans can be the real-time processor for every micro-decision in a saturation fight. More sensors is not about collecting more data. It is about building a truth machine under deception. In a poisoned battle space, a single sensor can be made to hallucinate. Radar can be jammed, returns can be shaped, passive receivers can be flooded, optical systems can be blinded by weather and glare, and all sensors can be overwhelmed by sheer number. The answer is not one perfect sensor. It is sensor diversity plus sensor separation. Diversity means different physics. Radar plus infrared plus passive RF plus electro-optical, so the enemy must attack multiple types at once. Separation means different vantage points, air, sea level, and forward nodes, so the enemy cannot jam everything with one bubble or spoof the same geometry across the whole fleet. When you combine those, the fleet stops being a single camera and becomes a multi-camera security system, where one angle can be fooled, but multiple angles create a pattern. This also changes how you treat data. The old mindset is, fuse everything into one picture and trust it. The new mindset is, fuse, but keep the provenance, meaning every track carries a memory of which sensors support it, how consistent those sensors are, and how that confidence evolves over time. That enables doctrine that is realistic, not absolute. Instead of demanding certainty, you demand corroboration. You treat tracks like courtroom evidence. One witness is helpful. 3 independent witnesses are persuasive, and witnesses with conflicts get flagged. We know distributed fusion is technically challenging, and we do not know exactly how resilient any one implementation will be under real wartime cyber and electronic attack. But the principle is stable. If your fleet's truth depends on one fusion node, then that fusion node is a single point of failure. So you distribute fusion too. Local nodes form local truths. The fleet negotiates shared truths when bandwidth allows, and when bandwidth fails, local truths still enable local survival. The doctrine shift is to see sensing as the foundation of combat power, not an accessory to missiles. The fleet that sees more reliably does not just shoot better, it panics less, wastes fewer interceptors, and keeps its decision speed when the enemy's goal is to slow you down with lies. The magazine problem is where doctrine gets brutally simple. A warship can only shoot what it carries, and reload at sea is not trivial. If the enemy can force you to spend one expensive missile per cheap target, you do not lose because you are incompetent. You lose because the exchange rate is designed to drain you. That is why the shift to more cheap interceptors is actually a shift to layered economics. You need multiple ways to say no. Soft kill is the cheapest no. Jam the guidance, spoof the seeker, confuse the navigation, degrade the link. Hard kill is the physical no. Gunfire, small interceptors, medium interceptors, then premium missiles. The doctrine shift is to build a ladder and to train the fleet to climb the ladder correctly under stress. If you start at the top rung every time, you fall off the ladder when the wave is long. Cheap interceptors come in many forms, and you do not need to name a specific system to understand the logic. The logic is to multiply engagement opportunities per incoming target. A gun with smart ammunition extends the number of shots you can take. A short-range interceptor increases probability when soft kill fails. A medium-range interceptor buys you distance when the swarm is thick. Premium missiles remain, but they become the specialist, not the default. We know navies are actively experimenting with combinations of these layers, and we do not know which exact mix will dominate because threats evolve, but the economic principle does not change. You want more shots, more layers, and more flexible allocation. Distribution helps here too. Instead of one ship carrying one magazine and one set of launchers, the fleet carries many magazines. If one node runs low, another can still contribute. If one node is damaged, it is not the end of all firepower. The doctrine shift is to treat interceptors like calories in a marathon. You do not sprint in the first mile. You ration. You prioritize. You use the cheapest effective tool first, and you maintain enough capacity for the final hard sprint when the truly dangerous threat appears. This is how you survive saturation, not by perfect shooting, but by sustainable defense over time. Removing single points of failure is not only about sensors and missiles, it is about everything that keeps the ship alive as a fighting system. A ship can have intact weapons and still be mission killed by power loss, cooling loss, damaged antennas, internal fire, flooding, or cyber disruption that turns trusted systems into question marks. In a distributed doctrine, you assume things will break, and you design so breaking does not equal collapse. That means redundancy where it matters, multiple pathways for data, multiple modes of sensing, degraded modes for combat systems, and procedures that allow local action even when connectivity is limited. It also means training crews to fight through confusion, because resilience is partly mechanical and partly psychological. A saturation fight is designed to create overload, and overload can lead to the most dangerous failure, humans losing confidence in their tools and hesitating at the worst moment. So, doctrine shift includes a cultural shift. You train for partial blindness, partial communications, partial automation. You teach operators to identify when the picture is being manipulated and to switch to alternative cues rather than freezing. You practice local defense without central guidance, and then practice rejoining the network when links return. You build trust, not by pretending systems are infallible, but by understanding how they fail. What we know is that modern systems are complex, and complexity creates hidden failure modes. What we do not know is which failure mode the enemy will exploit first, because that depends on their capabilities, their intelligence, and the environment. But we can design around the only certainty: the enemy will look for the cheapest way to create disproportionate effect. That is what single point of failure really means: a cheap input that causes a catastrophic output. Remove those and you force the enemy to pay more for every gain. Distribution, autonomy, sensor diversity, and layered magazines are all parts of the same goal: make the fleet a system that bends instead of snaps. The fleet that survives the next era is not the one that never gets hit. It is the one that keeps fighting when hit and keeps its decision speed when the enemy is trying to turn speed into paralysis. Now put these principles into a single mental movie. The enemy launches a mixed wave. Some drones are real, some are decoys, Some fly low in clutter, some carry jammers, some carry cameras to feed targeting. And some are simply there to be seen and to waste your time. In the old doctrine, one main ship becomes the center of gravity. Its sensors are the primary picture. Its combat system is the primary allocator, and other ships align to it. The enemy's job is simple. Poison that picture, saturate that allocator, and drain that magazine. They do not need to destroy the ship immediately. They can win by forcing the ship to spend fast and to hesitate at the wrong moments. Once the ship's confidence drops, the timeline compresses, and every choice becomes expensive. In the new doctrine, the wave hits a mesh. Forward nodes detect earlier, airborne sensors see from above, passive sensors catch emissions, and multiple ships generate parallel track hypotheses. Autonomy filters the noise, ranking threats, and spotting anomalies, while human commanders focus on intent, which corridor is defended, which assets are most important, and when to conserve premium shots. Cheap interceptors and soft kill engage early, not to guarantee kills, but to thin the wave and reduce cognitive load. The fleet does not require a single perfect picture. It has multiple partial pictures that can cross-check. If one node is jammed, others still see. If one ship takes damage, others still shoot. If communications degrade, local defense continues under pre-approved policies. We cannot claim this makes the fleet invincible, and we do not know the exact details of future engagements, but we can say the attacker's advantage shrinks when the defender is not forced into a single bottleneck. The attack must work harder, coordinate more, spend more, and accept that the defender can absorb losses without collapsing. That is the real shift, from platform-centric defense to system-centric survival, from one castle to a web of mutually supporting nodes that can fight while damaged, confused, and partially disconnected. So, why must big ships change or lose? Because the world is moving from rare, expensive threats to abundant, cheap threats. The laws of physics did not change, but the economics did, and economics rewrites doctrine faster than tradition wants to admit. A large ship can still be valuable. It can carry endurance, command teams, aviation, sensors, and long-range weapons, but it cannot remain a single point of failure. It cannot be the only brain, the only magazine, the only truth source, or the only decision maker. In the saturation era, the most dangerous illusion is thinking that a bigger ship means a bigger shield. Sometimes it just means a bigger target and a bigger dependency on perfect coordination. The doctrine shift is accepting that perfection is a fragile strategy, and resilience is the new form of strength. Distributed fleets, autonomy, more sensors, more cheap interceptors, and fewer single points of failure are not separate bullets. They are one coherent answer to one coherent threat. The threat is not any single drone. The threat is the ability of an attacker to create more dilemmas per minute than you can solve. If you solve dilemmas by centralizing decisions and spending premium shots, you will eventually face a moment where you run out of time, confidence, or inventory. If you solve dilemmas by distributing the workload across platforms, automating the time-critical steps with guardrails, cross-checking truth through sensor diversity, and preserving premium shots for premium threats, you keep your options alive. We know militaries are adapting toward these principles because the trend is visible in many programs and exercises, but we do not know which Navy will implement them with enough speed, discipline, and realism. That is what makes this the finale. Doctrine is not a document. It is a race against the attacker's learning curve. The winner is the side that stops worshiping single perfection and starts engineering scalable survival. If the future ocean fight is a math test, this is the answer key. Distribute, automate, diversify, and make your defenses cheap enough to last longer than the swarm. Big ships became centers. For a simple historical reason, they were the easiest way to concentrate sensors, command, and firepower into one coherent machine. If you only have a few aircraft, a few radars, and a limited number of long-range missiles, it feels rational to stack them onto one deck and call it decisive. That created a doctrine habit. Protect the crown jewel, because the crown jewel holds the fleet's brain. The problem is that habit survives, even when the environment changes. Today, the battlefield is not defined by a few scarce threats. It is defined by many cheap ones, and cheap threats hunt habits. They hunt predictable architecture, predictable command hierarchy, predictable engagement patterns. A large ship that depends on being the main brain, the main picture, and the main shooter becomes like a single lighthouse in a storm. The brighter it shines, the easier it is to find, spoof, and saturate. This is why the doctrine shift is not a debate about ship size, it is a debate about dependency. A large ship can still exist, but it cannot be the only place where decisions get made, because decisions are now the scarce resource. Think of it like a classroom exam where the attacker is allowed to ask you 100 questions in 1 minute, and you are only allowed to answer with one pen. The pen is not bad, it is simply a bottleneck. Old doctrine puts the pen in the flagship. New doctrine puts pens everywhere, and it teaches each student which questions they are allowed to answer without waiting for the teacher. That is, distributed fleets plus autonomy plus delegated authority. The attacker's goal is to force the fleet back into teacher mode. One central authority, one set of permissions, one picture, one decision queue. If they succeed, they win time, and time is what lets cheap mass become lethal. So the shift begins with a mental reset. Stop asking how strong the flagship is. Start asking how many ways the fleet can keep defending when the flagship is jammed, damaged, or simply overwhelmed. What we know is that modern conflicts keep rewarding the side that can sustain operations under disruption. And what we do not know is which disruption will come first: comms loss, sensor poisoning, cyber confusion, or raw saturation. But we can design doctrine that stays alive under all of them by refusing to put the fleet's identity into one hull. The kill chain is often explained like a clean flowchart: detect, track, identify, decide, engage, assess. In real life, it behaves more like a conveyor belt in a factory. And saturation is what happens when someone dumps a truckload of random parts onto the belt. The belt keeps moving, but the workers cannot sort fast enough, and the whole system begins producing mistakes. Some parts get ignored, some get mislabeled, some get assembled into nonsense. In a warship, those parts are tracks. A track is not just a dot, it is a package of assumptions, speed, altitude, identity, intent, and confidence. When you have a handful of tracks, a human team can babysit them. When you have hundreds, the team becomes a triage machine, and triage is where doctrine either saves you or kills you. If your triage rules assume a clean picture, they will fail under deception. If your triage rules assume a single brain must approve every step, they will fail under time compression. So the doctrine shift demands a new kill chain shape, not a single belt, but many smaller belts running in parallel, with a clear purpose for each. Local belts do local defense. Forward nodes maintain early warning. Airborne sensors provide cross-angle truth. The network shares what it can, but it does not require perfect sharing to function. Autonomy becomes the foreman that keeps the belts from jamming. It filters, it clusters, it flags inconsistencies, it proposes allocations. Humans remain the plant manager. They decide the policy, the protected asset list, the engagement boundaries, and the acceptable risk. Cheap interceptors are the spare tools that prevent one tool from wearing out instantly. Sensor diversity is quality control, multiple tests on the same part so a counterfeit is caught. And removing single points of failure is the rule that no one machine should be able to shut down the whole factory. What we know is that the attacker will try to force the fleet back into one conveyor belt by jamming and forcing centralized coordination. And what we do not know is how disciplined defenders will be in letting autonomy and local nodes act within intent when the situation feels scary. The fleet that survives is the one that practices this until it feels normal, because in combat you do what you rehearsed, not what you wish you had rehearsed. Networks feel like magic until they break, and at sea, they break in annoying, confusing ways. You can lose bandwidth, you can lose timing, you can lose trust in data, you can lose the ability to distinguish friendly emissions from enemy noise. A fleet that depends on perfect networking is like a tightrope walker who refuses to take a step unless the rope is perfectly still. The enemy knows this, so they aim at the rope. They jam, they spoof, they cyber probe, they overwhelm with traffic, and they try to create the worst kind of failure, not total blackout, but partial corruption. Total blackout is obvious, corruption is subtle, and subtle failures destroy confidence. When confidence dies, commanders slow down, and slowing down is what saturation wants. That is why Doctrine Shift treats comms as contested terrain, not a utility. You do not assume you have full connectivity. You assume you have bursts, partial links, and sometimes silence. This forces a practical design. The fleet needs multiple communications options, multiple pathways, and the ability to act even when the network is imperfect. That means local autonomy for defense and mission-type orders for offense. It means pre-planned engagement zones, where ships know their responsibilities without being told in the moment. It means data sharing that is smart, not greedy. Send the most important cues, not every pixel. It also means low probability of intercept behaviors, shorter transmissions, directional links, emission discipline, and fallback methods that still work in ugly conditions. We know navies invest heavily in networks, and we do not know which specific waveform or architecture will be most resilient in a future high-end fight. But we can rely on the principle that resilience comes from diversity, redundancy, and graceful degradation. A distributed fleet without resilient communications is just a scattered set of ships. A resilient network without local autonomy is just a fast way to spread confusion. The Doctrine Shift is pairing both. Build comms as a flexible bloodstream, and build each node to survive when the bloodstream is restricted. If the enemy can never fully stop the fleet from acting, they lose the cheap advantage of disruption. If they can stop the fleet from acting by touching one link, then the fleet is still living in the old era, pretending that the ocean will remain polite, while missiles and drones do the opposite. One of the most powerful ideas in distributed doctrine is the picket line, not as a wall, but as a moving adaptive layer. Instead of waiting for threats to appear on the main ship's horizon, the fleet pushes sensing outward. Think of it like sending scouts ahead with flashlights. You would rather see the danger from far away, even if the flashlight is weak, than see it late with a perfect spotlight. Uncrewed surface craft and small crewed pickets can carry sensors and even decoys, forcing the enemy to reveal themselves earlier. Uncrewed airborne systems can loiter and look down, reducing the blind spots of sea clutter. These nodes do not need to be exquisite, because their value comes from geometry and numbers. If you have 10 simple scouts, the enemy has to hide from 10 angles, and hiding from 10 angles is harder than hiding from one. This is how more sensors becomes better truth without making each individual sensor expensive. The second leap is off-board magazines. The fleet does not have to store all of its defensive calories inside the same hull. If smaller nodes can carry additional interceptors, decoys, or jammers, then the fleet can rebalance firepower and complicate enemy targeting. It also makes the fleet less brittle. If one ship takes damage, the fleet does not lose its entire defensive reserve. The key is that off-board nodes must be integrated in doctrine, not treated like gadgets. They need clear rules, clear roles, and clear behavior when comms degrade. What we know is that uncrewed systems can add coverage and capacity, and what we do not know is how survivable they will be under intense electronic attack and counter-scouting. That uncertainty is exactly why they should be numerous and cheap, not rare and precious. If you build them like jewels, you will hesitate to risk them, and the enemy will destroy them anyway. If you build them like tools, you will use them aggressively, and their loss will be acceptable because their job is to buy time and information. The Doctrine Shift is the acceptance that sacrifice and redundancy are part of modern survivability. You do not build one uncrewed scout you cannot lose. You build a system of scouts designed to be used, replaced, and improved, so the fleet's eyes never depend on a single fragile lens. Air changes naval warfare because it changes what over the horizon means. A ship's radar at sea level is limited by curvature and clutter. Airborne sensors see farther, see differently, and can act as relay points when surface comms are stressed. This is why distributed fleets often lean on an air layer, crewed aircraft, helicopters, drones, and potentially high-endurance platforms that can stay on station. The air layer is not just for offense, it is for truth. It helps validate tracks, identify deception patterns, and provide early warning that buys the fleet precious minutes. In saturation defense, minutes are everything. One extra minute can allow better allocations, better sequencing, and cheaper tools to be used first. This is also why the attacker will try to blind the air layer with jamming, long-range fires, or cyber attack, because the easiest way to make a fleet feel blind is to remove its altitude. Doctrine shift means the fleet does not treat the air layer as optional. It treats it as a structural component of defense. That includes planning for attrition, not assuming every aircraft survives, and building redundancy in platforms and sensors. It includes integrating passive detection, so the air layer is not broadcasting like a lighthouse. It includes using drones as sacrificial scouts when needed, because the job is to keep the fleet from being surprised by the most dangerous part of the wave. What we know is that airborne sensing can dramatically improve detection and classification, and what we do not know is whether future wars will allow persistent air coverage near a contested coastline. That uncertainty pushes the doctrine toward flexibility, shorter sorties, relay hops, distributed launch points, and rapidly replaceable assets. It also connects back to cheap interceptors and sensor diversity, because the air layer can guide weapons and validate threats, so the fleet does not waste premium shots. The deeper idea is that the fleet must think in 3 dimensions again. A surface ship alone sees a slice of reality. A fleet with an air layer sees a volume. A fleet with an air layer plus forward pickets sees a volume from multiple angles. That is how you fight deception. You do not argue with a lie. You surround it with independent observation until it collapses under its own contradictions. The doctrine shift is building that surround capability into the default way the fleet operates, not as a special trick used only when everything is calm. Delegated fires is where doctrine stops being inspirational and becomes operational. It answers a hard question: who is allowed to shoot, when, and based on what confidence? In old centralized models, the safest looking answer is the center decides because it feels controlled. In a saturation fight, that answer becomes dangerous because the center becomes the slowest point. So delegated fires means the commander sets intent and constraints ahead of time, and local units execute within those constraints without waiting for approval in the moment. It is like setting rules for a goalkeeper. If the ball crosses this line at this speed, you dive, you do not ask permission. The permission was granted earlier through doctrine, training, and rules of engagement. This is how autonomy becomes acceptable to humans, because humans are still the authors of the policy. The machine is not choosing morality. It is executing a pre-authorized response when time is too short for conversation. This requires discipline and trust. Trust comes from transparency, testing, and clear boundaries. Discipline comes from practicing degraded scenarios until people stop panicking when the screen is messy. What we know is that hesitation kills timelines, and what we do not know is how much uncertainty future deception will create. But we can design delegated fires to be robust. For example, requiring corroboration from multiple sensors before automatic engagement and allowing local units to shift modes when confidence drops. A distributed fleet with delegated fires can absorb saturation because it does not funnel every decision through one door. It also reduces the enemy's ability to create paralysis. If the enemy jams the flagship, the rest of the fleet does not freeze. It continues under intent. If the enemy spoofs a track on one node, cross-checking can catch it. If cross-checking cannot catch it, the fleet has layers, soft kill, and cheaper tools first, with premium shots reserved for high-confidence, high-risk targets. This is doctrine expressed as tempo control. The fleet decides what must be fast and what can be slow. The attacker wants everything to be slow for the defender. Delegated fires forces parts of the defender's response to remain fast even when confusion rises. That is how you keep decision speed as a weapon, not as a liability. In the new era, the fleet that controls tempo under deception is the fleet that survives. Doctrine is not real until it is trained under pressure. It is easy to say distributed, autonomous, resilient, and then when the exercise becomes uncomfortable, everyone reverts to central control because it feels safer. That reversion is exactly what the enemy is counting on, so the doctrine shift must be baked into training, wargaming, and certification. Crews must repeatedly practice with partial comms, degraded sensors, and ambiguous tracks. They must practice operating when the network cannot deliver the full picture. They must practice local defense, and then the difficult part, resynchronizing with the fleet when connectivity returns without creating friendly fire risk or duplication. This is like practicing a fire drill in smoke, not just walking to the exit when the lights are on. If you only train in perfect conditions, your doctrine is a costume you wear for parades, not armor you wear for war. This is also where autonomy earns legitimacy. People trust what they have seen work repeatedly, so you build drills where the automation is tested against deception and where operators learn its failure modes. You build confidence language, what the system means by high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, and how that maps to human decisions and engagement ladders. You also build a habit of evidence. Tracks are not believed because the screen shows them. They are believed because multiple independent cues support them. What we know is that humans become calmer and faster when they have practiced ambiguity, and what we do not know is the exact blend of future threats, but we can practice the meta skill, operating under uncertainty without freezing. The final piece is leadership. Commanders must be willing to accept that some local actions will be imperfect because perfection is not available under saturation. They must prefer a resilient fleet that sometimes makes small mistakes over a centralized fleet that makes one catastrophic mistake when the bottleneck breaks. This is the doctrine shift at the human level. It is the willingness to distribute authority and to live with controlled risk, because the alternative is uncontrolled collapse. A fleet that trains this deeply becomes hard to saturate, not because it has infinite missiles, but because it has infinite adaptability. Procurement is where doctrine goes to die, because budgets love big visible things. A large ship is easy to explain to politicians and the public. It looks like power you can photograph. A distributed fleet looks like many smaller line items, and the value is in the network effect, which is harder to sell. That creates a dangerous mismatch. Leaders buy platforms while the battlefield rewards systems. In the saturation era, a fleet is not judged by the beauty of a single hull. It is judged by how many dilemmas it can solve per minute without collapsing. That means procurement must start asking different questions. Not how advanced is the radar, but how many independent radars can we field, at how many angles, with what resilience to jamming. Not how fast is the missile, but how many affordable engagements can we sustain in the first hour of a fight. Not how impressive is the combat system, but how does the fleet fight when that combat system is partially blind, partially jammed, and partially disconnected. Big ships can still be part of the answer, but only if the procurement logic stops treating them as the entire answer. The moment you accept that, you stop building castles and start building webs. This is where single point of failure becomes a financial concept too. If you spend most of your budget on a few exquisite units, you are creating strategic brittleness. One accident, one maintenance delay, one combat loss, and a large fraction of your combat power disappears. Distributed fleets turn that into a smoother curve. Individual losses hurt, but do not end the plan. What we know is that modern precision and surveillance make it harder to hide large platforms. And what we do not know is how survivable any one flagship will be when the enemy can combine long-range sensing with cheap saturation. But we can infer the direction. Survivability is moving away from never be hit and toward be hit and keep functioning. Procurement must therefore prioritize redundancy, modularity, replaceability, and quantity, where quantity creates resilience. That means more sensors that are good enough, more interceptors that are cheap enough, more nodes that are expendable enough to be used aggressively, and more autonomy that reduces human bottlenecks. The doctrine shift is a change in what counts as strength. Strength becomes the ability to keep the fleet's decision speed and engagement capacity alive after the first wave, after the second wave, and after the network stops behaving nicely. The fleet that budgets for that reality is the fleet that does not get surprised by the math. Logistics is the silent boss fight in saturation warfare. You can win the first exchange and still lose the campaign if you cannot replenish faster than the enemy can regenerate cheap threats. Traditional naval logistics were built around fuel and maintenance, not around magazine depth, in a world where the defender might expend dozens of interceptors in minutes. This is why doctrine shift forces a rethink of rearming, resupplying, and distributing ammunition. If a fleet depends on returning to port to reload, it is operating on a schedule that the enemy can exploit. If reload at sea is slow, risky, or rare, then the fleet's effective endurance under attack shrinks dramatically. Distributed fleets make this problem visible because you are no longer thinking one ship, one magazine. You are thinking a network of magazines that must stay topped up. That suggests the need for mobile magazines, ships or platforms whose main job is to carry and distribute interceptors and decoys, and to do it in ways that are resilient to surveillance and attack. If the enemy can track your logistics routes, they can attack your ability to keep defending without ever fighting your best combatants directly. So the doctrine shift pushes logistics into the warfighting plan, not as a follow-on detail. It means designing interceptors that are easier to handle and replenish, designing modular launch systems, and building procedures for at-sea reload that are practiced and protected. It also means distribution at the logistics layer, multiple resupply options, multiple routes, deception in movement, and potentially smaller, more frequent replenishment rather than a few large, predictable ones. What we know is that the industrial base and supply chain are part of modern conflict, and what we do not know is how quickly any navy can surge production of the kinds of cheap interceptors and uncrewed nodes that saturation defense demands. But the principle is stable. If the defender cannot replace expenditures faster than the attacker can replace threats, then even perfect tactics become a slow loss. This is why cheap interceptors is not only about cost per shot, it is about manufacturability, storage, transport, and replenishment. A fleet built for the new era must be able to eat a wave, absorb the expense, and keep operating without a long pause. Otherwise, the attacker wins by pacing, not by brilliance. In the end, doctrine shift is also a shift from thinking about the battle as a moment to thinking about the battle as a sustained demand on your inventory, your crews, and your industrial ability to keep saying no. If you want a simple rule for saturation defense, it is this: every layer should be cheaper than the layer behind it, and faster than the layer behind it. The outer layer buys time and information. The middle layers thin the wave. The inner layers protect the hull when everything else leaks. Old doctrine often treated layers as technology demonstrations, impressive on paper, but not integrated into an economic ladder. New doctrine treats layers as a spending strategy. Soft kill should be the first attempt whenever it can reduce confidence in the incoming weapon because it costs less than a missile and can be applied broadly. Guns and small interceptors should handle the bulk of cheap drones because they are more sustainable. Medium interceptors should cover the holes when the wave is thick and time is short. Premium missiles should be saved for the threats that truly require them: high speed, high lethality, high probability of kill requirement. When you structure layers this way, you are not chasing perfection, you are chasing endurance. Endurance is what saturation's attacks are designed to destroy. This layered ladder also changes sensor design. You do not need perfect identification for every layer. You need the right confidence at the right layer. A soft kill attempt can be triggered with lower confidence because the cost is low and the risk of wasting a premium shot is avoided. A premium shot demands higher confidence and corroboration. Autonomy helps manage this ladder by matching confidence levels to engagement options and by preventing humans from making emotional, expensive choices under pressure. What we know is that humans tend to overreact when overwhelmed, and what we do not know is how hard future deception will push that tendency. So doctrine must formalize the ladder, teach it, test it, and enforce it through system design. This is also why cheap interceptors are not just a number, they are a doctrine enabler. If you do not have a deep middle, you will either burn premium missiles too early, or you will hold fire too long and get hit. A deep middle lets you keep tempo without gambling the entire magazine. Distribution strengthens this ladder because it spreads layers across the fleet. One node might specialize in sensing, another in soft kill, another in point defense, another in medium interceptors. The network then becomes a layered organism, rather than each ship trying to be a perfect, self-contained fortress. The doctrine shift is accepting specialization within a distributed fleet and accepting that collective defense is stronger than isolated defense when the wave is designed to drown isolated defenders. Big ships do not vanish in the doctrine shift. They become different kinds of assets. They become command services, aviation hubs, sensor hubs, and long-range strike nodes, but only if they stop being single points of failure. That means designing them to operate even when their picture is partial, and designing the fleet to operate even when the big ship is degraded. In a distributed doctrine, the big ship is not the king. It is one important organ in a body that can still move if that organ is injured. This requires hard choices. It means big ships should not be the only carriers of critical sensors. They should be one of many. It means their weapons should be complemented by off-board magazines so they are not the only deep well of defense. It means their command functions should be distributable, with backup command nodes and pre-planned delegation so the fleet does not lose its mind if the flagship loses connectivity. It also means accepting that the best protection for a big ship is often not thicker armor, but distance, deception, dispersion, and a surrounding mesh of nodes that make targeting it uncertain. This is where distributed fleets becomes a protection strategy for capital ships rather than a replacement. A capital ship inside a web is harder to isolate. The web can create false centers of gravity, decoy nodes that radiate signatures, pickets that draw attention, and uncrewed elements that complicate the enemy's scouting. Autonomy helps here too, by managing emissions, coordinating deception behaviors, and preserving the big ship's decision bandwidth. More sensors help by extending warning and reducing surprise. More cheap interceptors help by ensuring the fleet's defense does not collapse into a premium-only, low-volume posture that can be drained. And fewer single points of failure is the guiding principle that ties it together. If one node fails, the mission continues. What we know is that modern warfare rewards the side that can keep operating under pressure, and what we do not know is the exact set of weapons the next enemy will prioritize against capital ships. But we can prepare for the invariant. The enemy will try to create a decisive failure with a cheap method. The doctrine shift is the refusal to allow cheap methods to have decisive effect. Big ships can still matter, but only as part of a system that is built to survive confusion, survive attrition, and keep fighting after the first perfect plan is ruined. In the next segments, we will push this into force design and strategic posture, how these ideas change where fleets operate, how they deter, and how they avoid being forced into a single catastrophic engagement on the attacker's terms. Posture is doctrine made visible on a map. In the old mindset, a fleet could afford to posture like a chess queen, powerful, centralized, and confident that it could manage any threat as long as it kept its crown jewel protected. In the saturation era, that posture becomes predictable, and predictability is what cheap threats feed on. A distributed fleet changes posture by changing the rules of risk. Instead of one ship needing to be everywhere at once, the fleet becomes a field of influence, a set of sensing and striking nodes that can spread, compress, and shift based on the threat. That means you can operate with fewer must-not-lose positions, because the fleet is not betting its entire identity on one platform in one grid square. It also means you can shape the enemy's scouting problem. If your fleet can put sensors forward without putting your most valuable ships forward, you gain early warning without handing the enemy a perfect target. If you can position decoy nodes, pickets, and uncrewed elements along likely corridors, you force the enemy to spend time and resources confirming what is real. That time is doctrine in action, because time is what lets you apply cheaper layers and avoid panic spending. This posture shift also changes the strategic goal from control the sea to deny the enemy certainty. Sea control is hard when cheap mass can appear from many directions, and when the defender's picture can be poisoned. But sea denial, the ability to make enemy movement unsafe and unpredictable, becomes more achievable when your fleet is a distributed sensing web with layered defense. A fleet that can deny the enemy clean targeting data can still operate, even if it cannot guarantee perfect safety. What we know is that modern conflicts reward the side that can keep options open under uncertainty, and what we do not know is how quickly future fights will escalate from shadowing to shooting. That uncertainty pushes doctrine toward posture that is flexible, nodes that can disperse quickly, and command intent that can survive sudden transition. Distributed fleets are built for that, because they can be quiet, they can spread, they can surge sensors, and they can retreat without looking like defeat. The goal is not to be invulnerable. The goal is to make the enemy's plan fragile. If their plan requires one clean strike on one center, and there is no single center, their plan becomes a guess. In modern warfare, forcing the enemy to guess is often better than trying to look invincible, because invincibility invites the attacker to test you with cheap volume until something cracks. A distributed posture makes that testing expensive and slow, and that is the first layer of deterrence. Deterrence used to be about threat of punishment. You hit me, I hit you harder. In a saturation world, deterrence increasingly becomes about threat of futility. You hit me, and you do not get the outcome you want. That is a subtle but powerful shift. If the attacker believes they can cripple a fleet by blinding one ship, draining one magazine, or jamming one link, then they will be tempted to try because the cost looks manageable. If the attacker believes the fleet is a web that continues to function through disruption, then the attacker's cheap advantage disappears. They might still attack, but they can no longer expect a decisive result from a single clever trick. That is why resilience is deterrence. Distributed fleets communicate, not just through speeches, but through demonstrated exercises, fleets operating in dispersed formations, sharing tracks, executing delegated fires, and showing they can fight through comms loss. Autonomy plays a role here too, because it signals tempo. The defender can respond faster than the attacker can iterate. Cheap interceptors signal endurance. The defender can survive multiple waves without going empty. Sensor diversity signals truth. The defender is harder to deceive. But deterrence is also perception management, and perception can be attacked. The enemy will try to create propaganda effects. A single video of a ship being overwhelmed can reshape politics. That makes the single point of failure problem even bigger, because a single catastrophic event can become strategic even if the fleet is still capable. Distributed doctrine reduces that risk by reducing the likelihood of one catastrophic narrative. Losses may still occur, but they are less likely to be decisive and less likely to be framed as the fleet collapsed. What we know is that information warfare amplifies dramatic failures. And what we do not know is how public tolerance for naval losses will look in a future crisis. So deterrence must include narrative resilience, a doctrine that expects attacks, absorbs them, and continues to operate without collapsing into panic or retreat. This is another reason autonomy and delegation matter, because they reduce the chance of slow, confused responses that look like helplessness. A fleet that responds coherently under pressure projects strength. Not theatrical strength, but system strength. The kind that says, we planned for this, we trained for this, and your cheap tricks do not produce the political shock you are hoping for. Deterrence in the new era is not a threat of perfection. It is a threat of persistence. If the enemy cannot win quickly, cheaply, and decisively, then their calculus changes. They must spend more, risk more, and accept uncertain outcomes. And that uncertainty is exactly what prevents many wars from starting in the first place. Coalitions are both a force multiplier and a new set of single points of failure, depending on how they are built. In a coalition, you gain more sensors, more shooters, more geography, and more redundancy. But you also inherit interoperability problems, mismatched rules of engagement, and data trust issues. A distributed doctrine cannot stop at the edge of one navy. If allies fight as separate castles, the attacker can pick them off and poison them one by one. If allies fight as a federation of nodes, the attacker faces a far harder problem. That means designing interoperability as doctrine, not as a technical afterthought. It means common track standards, common confidence language, common deconfliction procedures, and a shared understanding of what autonomy is allowed to do in a mixed force. It also means building cross-link redundancy so that the coalition does not depend on one gateway ship or one satellite path to share truth. Coalition distribution must include coalition resilience. This is where sensor diversity becomes strategic. If one nation provides airborne sensors, another provides pickets, another provides electronic warfare, and another provides deep magazines, the coalition becomes a layered organism. The danger is centralizing fusion in one place because it feels neat. Neat is fragile. A coalition must be able to operate with partial sharing, meaning each partner has enough local truth to defend themselves and contribute without a perfect common picture. What we know is that data sharing can be constrained by classification and trust concerns, and what we do not know is how those constraints will behave in the first hours of a crisis. So doctrine must plan for graded sharing. Share what matters for defense, even if you cannot share everything. Autonomy can help by translating local sensor cues into high-level alerts that are less sensitive but still useful. Delegated fires can be aligned through pre-agreed corridors and policies so that local units do not wait for multinational consensus when the timeline is seconds. The coalition that practices this becomes a web across flags, not a committee across flags. And that matters because a smart attacker will try to fracture coalition cohesion through cyber rumors, spoofed incidents, and manufactured confusion. If the coalition's defense depends on perfect trust and perfect comms, it can be shattered without being beaten. If the coalition's defense depends on distributed intent and local resilience, it can absorb political noise and still defend. That is the doctrine shift at the alliance level. Build a federation that is hard to blind, hard to saturate, and hard to paralyze, even when information is contested and trust is under pressure. When allies fight as a web, the attacker must fight the entire web, not just the biggest ship. Now compress the entire doctrine shift into a force design blueprint you can test with one question: what happens after the first wave? If the answer is, we stop, we regroup, we wait for perfect comms, we conserve because we are low on premium missiles, then the doctrine is still old, even if the platforms are new. If the answer is, we keep defending, we keep sensing, we keep acting locally, we conserve premium shots by using layers, and the network keeps functioning through degradation, then the doctrine is shifting. The blueprint is simple in concept and hard in execution. Distribute the fleet physically so no one platform is the center of gravity. Distribute sensing so truth comes from many angles. Distribute decision-making so tempo survives disruption. Distribute magazines so endurance survives repeated waves. And distribute failure so loss is painful but not decisive. Then, add autonomy to protect human bandwidth, not to replace human intent. Add cheap interceptors to protect economics, not just to add firepower. Add training that lives in ambiguity, not in perfect simulations. That is the package, not a list of technologies, a system of survival. The finale point is this: saturation warfare punishes the idea that war is a duel between champions. It is not a duel, it is a stress test. The attacker wins by producing more problems than you can solve, and the defender wins by building a fleet that can solve problems in parallel without collapsing when the picture is dirty. What we know is that the cost curves favor the side that can create cheap mass, and what we do not know is how quickly defenders can retool doctrine, procurement, and training to match that reality. But the direction is clear. Fleets that cling to single points of failure will lose confidence before they lose steel, and once confidence is gone, hesitation spreads faster than any missile. Fleets that embrace distribution and resilience will still take hits, but they will keep fighting, and that is what changes the enemy's calculus. This doctrine shift is not about abandoning big ships. It is about ending dependency on them as the only brain, the only truth, and the only magazine. The future belongs to webs, not castles. When the ocean becomes a math test, the only acceptable strategy is to design the system so the math works for you. Over time, under deception, under disruption, and after the first wave, and the second. That is the real definition of winning at sea now. Not a perfect moment of dominance, but sustained, scalable survival that leaves the attacker with no cheap victory to buy.